morning, LinkedIn Live. Good morning, LinkedIn Live. We are live. Wow. I thought the technology was going to fail me there. Yes, if you are joining live in the UK, we're obviously coming off the back of general election overnight. So this is going to be an election-free zone, I promise you. I'm just waiting for Etty Bailey King, my guest, to join. I think she's out there in the ether somewhere, figuring out how to log in, I think. So hopefully she'll be joining me shortly, because we're going to be talking about inclusive and accessible comms. And the title of this, you can't say anything these days. It came from obviously myself and Etty talking about what we're going to talk about, but very recently, I was at judging day for the Business Book Awards. I'm a judge for the Business Book Awards. Some of you know I'm absolutely obsessed with books, right? And I was talking to the head of judging for the Business Book Awards, who shall remain nameless. And we were just talking about some of the very public faux pas that have happened in terms of people saying the wrong thing or the right thing, etc. And I said we need to write a book that's called something like "Cut Me Some Slack," right? Because we were talking about how assuming that what's being said isn't intentionally disrespectful or offensive, we just do seem to have a climate where you can't say anything these days, right? And that's kind of where where the suggestion for the topic came from. So Etty has just joined backstage. So I'm going to pull Etty front of stage. So let's do this now.
Hey, good morning. Hi, Cheryl. Hi.
Good morning, Etty. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Lovely to be here.
Thank you for joining. I was just saying as well before you jumped on, this is going to be an election-free zone, right? So anyone that's fed up of hearing about the Jenny Leck, as it's now called, apparently, this is going to be election-free zone. So yeah, morning, Etty. How's your week been?
Yeah, really good, thanks. How's yours been?
Yeah, very good. Very it's very I don't know about anybody else, but June is turning out to be pretty busy. I think everybody's trying to clear their to-do list before the summer holidays, right, here in the UK. So it's been a busy one, but Friday's here, we can't complain. And good morning to anybody that's joining us live, or if you're watching on the replay, please say good morning in the chat. I don't know whether some people are still glued to the results, but this is a results-free zone. So if you want to kind of just zone out of that for a little bit, then please do join myself and Etty. So Etty Bailey King, thank you so much for joining. So for those that don't know Etty, please go and check out Etty's amazing bio and profile. But I guess your background, I was looking at it, some really interesting stuff that you've got in your experience. So I guess I would sort of describe your experience as kind of meeting at the intersection of being like a comms specialist, but also the third sector as well, very much in terms of, so I guess purpose-led sort of, social justice organizations, I guess is where you focus. But the one thing that I did love actually that I pulled out is that you were on the British national debating team.
I haven't been asked about that one in a while. Yes, I was.
Yeah. How did you get involved in that?
Oh, what a funny, yeah. I think like it's a classic of a certain type of school student, right? Like if
Okay.
anyone here was anything like me, like loved books, loved reading, maybe like quite a word person, I felt really comfortable with the written word and to a lesser extent with the spoken word. Like I wasn't always
Right.
like the most socially confident kid, but because of my love of like putting together a logical argument and making it sound
Right.
beautiful, I remember when
Yeah.
I was like 15, hearing about this thing called debating, and it just blew my
Yeah.
mind. I was like, wait, I get to do like all my favorite things. I get to sort of sit with words and language and play around
Yeah.
with them and put them together in a way that might like compel other people to listen and
Yeah.
maybe take action. I just thought it was
Yeah.
the perfect hobby. And I remember
Yeah.
joking, oh, finally, there's a sport that I can play, something that works for me
Yeah.
as a word
Yeah.
person.
Yeah, I love it. And there's something about one of the things I sometimes talk about is, almost like the art of public speaking and being able to put words together. And do you think we need more of that in schools? I know I'm completely going off on a tangent, but there is something about the ability to articulate oneself, and whether or not we've maybe lost the art of that to an extent, today.
Yeah, I think for anyone who wants to explore it, I certainly wouldn't say like, oh, every school kid should be forced to be on a debating team. But for me, it was transformative. It gave me so much confidence. It reassured me kind of that there was like a place for me in
Wow.
like, yeah, almost in the world. And it really just,
Yeah.
yeah, built my confidence, because in the style of debating that I did, you get 15 minutes notice. So you get handed a
Right.
motion, and it's like, yeah, it can be any policy at all. And you're just told what the topic is and what side you're on. And then you've got 15 minutes to put together your speech and your argument. And it just
Yeah.
trains you to be able to think really deeply, really quickly, and to just put together something that's compelling based on quite little knowledge. And I like that it
Yeah.
doesn't expect you to know everything about anything. It's just about working within the knowledge you have, which then
Yeah.
gives you so much confidence for other sort
Yeah.
of life challenges when you're thinking,
Yeah.
well, I don't know everything about this, but I can find
Yeah.
my way through it. I can
Yeah.
construct an argument.
Do you know what I love about that as well as a concept? There is something about, and I posted about this a couple of weeks ago. There is something about, because we're in a world that is increasingly polarized, right? And there is something about really understanding the other, other people's positions that is so important to even understanding your own. And I think sometimes we maybe don't take the time out to do that. So that's interesting. Okay. Anyway, we digress. Maybe I need to get you back on here just to talk about debate. Right. So yes, thank you so much for joining us. So one of the I know when we first connected a few months ago, one of the things that we talked about was why it's hard to get certain things right, why it's hard to always say the right thing. So we're not talking about, people that are being intentionally offensive or anything like that. And I sort of confess to you, and I'll confess it now to the whole of LinkedIn, but anybody that I've done training with will know this. The one area that I really struggle with is pronouns, as in getting, somebody's pronoun right. So that's an example of where, I don't intentionally want to get it wrong, but it's quite hard for my brain to kind of get it wrong. And that was something that we talked about. So let's just maybe start this conversation talking about those verbal faux pas that we sometimes make, and it could be written. And how do we, why does it happen? But more importantly, how do we either correct for it, or when it happens, what do we do about it?
Yeah. So yeah, starting with the pronouns piece. So it's funny because simultaneously, actually, I might describe it this way. So I
Sure.
always sort of train people using these two principles of like
Okay.
maximum compassion and maximum challenge. So I think we
Yeah.
should have maximum compassion for ourselves, that
Right.
these little words that we've grown up speaking, whatever our languages are, but like for me, that's the English language. So words like
Hmm.
he, she, they, and so on, they're
Yeah.
baked in so deeply in our learning of language, and we learn them at
Yeah.
such an early age. I personally was very much like trained to see the world as there's only two genders, and all men use the pronouns he, him, and all women
Yeah.
use the pronouns she, her, and that's all there is.
Yeah.
And growing up, that, formed my understanding of the world. And it wasn't until I was quite like a young adult before I learned that there's lots of other genders, and people can be non-binary and genderqueer, and people can use any pronoun, and you can't actually
Hmm.
tell what gender somebody is, and you can't tell what gender they are from their pronouns. So
Yeah.
when I say maximum compassion, it's about recognizing, like, of course we struggle with these things. That's really, really deeply learned and
Mm.
long reinforced knowledge. So it's totally understandable that we would find it really tricky. But where we have to bring in the maximum challenge is like, well, we know that it really matters. We know that using the correct pronouns for somebody in
Mhm.
healthcare settings, there's research that finds that using the right pronouns for people can reduce their risk of dying by suicide. It has a real impact, and it's a
Yeah.
really important action that we all need to take to remember
Mhm.
people's pronouns and get them right, and like affirm that we see them as they are. So I'm never going to say like, you're a bad, terrible person if you get somebody's pronouns
Yeah.
wrong. I'll say absolute compassion. I too have struggled with this for, many, many years. And then bringing in that maximum challenge, I would say it's just all about practice. So I
Yeah.
literally will like stand in front of my bathroom mirror at home and just practice saying somebody's pronouns 10 or 20 or 30 times, talking
Right.
to myself, walking around the house thinking, remember, I used to know that person as she, her for many years, but now they are they, them. I'm going to keep practicing that and saying it out loud, and I'll
Right.
practice on my own. And then I might find, if we're colleagues and we both know the same person, I might practice talking about my colleague to the other person and say, did you get their memo? What did you think of their thoughts? Are you going to reply to them or shall I reply to them? And just creating those practice opportunities. So I'm not
Right.
doing all of the practicing directly to that person's face. There's a lovely comparison between pronouns and names, which Professor Lal Ziman, who's a linguistics professor, came up with.
Okay.
And I love it so much because Lal says pronouns are a lot like names in that, like, you can't guess them from the outside.
Yeah.
You might think that and you can try, you can guess, but you may well be wrong. There are more than two pronouns, just like there's more than two names. They're both facts, and I don't get to decide them about somebody else. So I might be like, you look so much like a Mary, and you, Cheryl, would be like, no, I'm a Cheryl. Like, it's not up to me to, have my own idea of who you are.
Yeah.
Your information that you decide. And for me, the best piece that Lal comes up with is, like getting somebody's name wrong, it's not the end of the world if you get someone's pronouns wrong at all, so long as you handle it carefully and thoughtfully. If you go, so sorry, my mistake, and then you really just focus on getting it right next time, so you don't make a big performative apology, where you go, oh, you must hate me, you must be so offended. That can then cause a lot of harm for the other person. So if you just acknowledge it, mark it, concentrate on getting it right next time, don't make it all about yourself into this big performance. Yeah, they're quite similar experiences. And I think it's a nice example of how, like, it's really not the end of the world. You can do it. Maximum compassion, maximum challenge.
Yeah. I love the idea of the practicing. That's a great one, isn't it? Especially if, so for example, that you're going to be going into a meeting with somebody who, either the pronoun has changed or, one thing that you said there about sometimes the pronoun is different to how, our view of how somebody should present based on, gender or sex, etc. Because even before the explosion of pronouns, right, you would get, 20, 30, 40 years ago, there are some individuals, particularly with women, because as women, we often have, we've been sort of wearing trousers. And, if you think of somebody like an Annie Lennox, who's presents quite androgynously, right? So I think for a long time, actually, there have probably been a lot of women that, in terms of our gender expression, maybe some people would maybe see you from distance, you got short hair, you may be wearing trousers, blah, 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 assume that you were a he, right? Which is really interesting, isn't it? But now, we've it's become like this big thing. But I love your, I love your advice there about, just like the practicing and then obviously not making it into a big deal, etc. What are your thoughts about they, them? Is that just almost like a safer option to practice, or is that just a cop out? Asking for a friend.
I love the idea that we should use they, them as our default. And again, when I say should, I don't mean in like a finger wagging, like you should always do this. I mean more something a bit kind of looser and freer, which is, what if we just got into the habit of not thinking we know someone's gender? And what if we just got into the general mindset of thinking, I don't know someone's pronouns? So I always give this example of when, say, you're like taking speakers at a conference and people have got their hands up. Do you say, I'll take a question from the lady in green, or do you say the person in green? And like the example that you shared, it doesn't have to be, as you say, this is sort of like, it's sometimes perceived as like a recent phenomenon, like, oh, suddenly people are changing their pronouns. But forever we've had the problem of, like, you can't guess someone's gender from the outside. And if someone is a woman with a masculine presentation, or if someone is experimenting with new pronouns and is trying to figure themselves out, it's like, there's just no downside, in my opinion, if you just practice saying, I'll take a question from that person. I welcome my colleague, just calling people like staff, team members, folks, all of that. It doesn't have to be a sort of radical shift in everything about how you think. It can just be saying, I'm not going to guess, so I'll say person or some other gender neutral term. Yeah, I really like that. I really support that.
I love that. Great. I love that. And then perfect. Okay, I think maybe Etty has somebody at the door. This is the this is the joys of live. I'm actually currently dog sitting, so if you do hear a dog barking or potentially crying in the background, that will potentially be why. But yeah, I was just saying, Etty, I'm guessing you probably had somebody at the door or somebody calling or something. The joys of live, of LinkedIn Live conversations. Let's go on to one of the other things that we talked about, and I think there is definitely something in this, and a lot more organizations are thinking about, which is a great thing, neurodiversity or neurodivergence, in terms of what that means for the way that we communicate, and the way that we sort of transmit information and get our messages across, etc. For somebody that's maybe listening to this, and maybe as an organization they haven't even really thought about this yet, whether that be thinking about internal comms, their website, external comms, etc. What are some of the main areas that you tend to sort of start with when you go into organizations around this topic?
I think for me, so first there's understanding what neurodivergence is. And
Mm-hmm.
I think so often we'll think like dyslexia, ADHD,
Yeah.
autism, dyspraxia. And those are all examples of neurodivergence. But people often don't realize that actually the neurodivergent umbrella just describes any way of thinking which differs from like the imagined typical. It's
Okay.
just about thinking and remembering and processing information in any way that differs
Mm.
from the sort of like social ideal of the typical brain. And I think
Yeah.
when you understand that, you start to see how it's so much more than like just those sort of typically like medically diagnosed learning differences.
Mm.
For example, I've got obsessive compulsive disorder, that's
Mm-hmm.
neurodivergence,
Yeah.
epilepsy, Tourette's, Down syndrome, misophonia, which is when you're very sensitive to certain sounds.
Okay.
It's like, because it's this incredibly broad category, I think
Mm.
it helps if you understand neurodivergence is everywhere in pretty much any group of people. In fact, frankly, if you've got one person, it's very, very likely they might be neurodivergent in some way, but definitely
Yeah.
when we're getting into a group setting, I think
Yeah.
it's about recognizing, don't think of it as like an exceptional situation. Think of it as a given that there will be people in that space
Right.
who are
Yeah.
neurodivergent. And then don't worry too much about all the different specific needs that people might have. It is
Mm-hmm.
really important to understand individual needs. So, for an example, some dyslexic people need specific color combinations where the color,
Mm-hmm.
background, and the text really helps them to read the written word accurately.
Right.
Certain typefaces might work really well for them. It's really important
Mm.
that you don't have lots of double spaces or italics. So there are specific needs like that, but I would say don't get too hung up on those, because
Mm-hmm.
those are relatively easy, in my opinion, to gather and then figure out in your group.
Right.
Concentrate on the broad things that work better for almost everyone. So for pretty much everyone,
Mm.
short sentences, short paragraphs, saying exactly what you mean. So just being literal. You can still use like metaphors and idioms. So it's raining cats and dogs today, or oh,
Yeah.
we need someone who can wear many hats for this job. Like that's a metaphor. We don't
Right.
really mean you
Right.
can wear many hats. You can use all of that figurative language, but just know that there's a lot of people, including many autistic people, for
Mm.
whom that's quite inaccessible and it's just not obvious what
Right.
you mean. So I would say keep using those forms of language, but just know that you need to provide a little brief literal explainer. So you could say, and by that we mean you've got to be very versatile and able to do lots of projects.
Right.
Or maybe
Right.
don't use the metaphor at all. Maybe just say exactly what you mean and
Yeah.
just give concrete examples. And like, it can sound quite overwhelming when you get into all the different details of how to make your communication neuro-inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And at the sort of most technical end, there are some things like that. But broadly speaking, we're really just talking short sentences, saying what you mean, giving
Yeah.
people examples, and just recognizing that everyone has really different learning styles and processing speeds.
Yeah.
So the way that a lot of forms of neurodivergence show up is, and professionals will sometimes call it the spiky profile, which
Mm.
means that neurodivergent thinking patterns are considered spiky because if you were to map somebody's, let's take the example of an autistic person who
Mm-hmm.
maybe has So the autism spectrum is often thought to be a line going from less autistic to very autistic. And that's a
Right.
misconception. It's actually more like a circle with like lots of
Okay.
little prongs on it. And you might be an autistic person who's highly verbal with like incredibly sophisticated verbal processing, which is called
Right.
hyperlexia. Or you might be a non-speaking autistic person.
Hmm.
And that sort of the verbal spike would be quite extreme. And then your
Right.
auditory processing might be like relatively slow. And so it's about there being these variations in your skills and abilities, which might
Right.
seem surprising because we sort of imagine, oh, if someone's incredibly gifted at verbal expression, they will also have speedy auditory processing, right? We imagine that all
Yeah.
your skills will be at a similar level.
Yeah.
And neurodivergence is about those attributes being at quite different levels. So it sort of
Right.
comes down to just like, don't make assumptions
Yeah.
just because you get someone in an interview and they seem super eloquent that they're also going to be able to like understand loads of instructions at the same time.
Yeah.
They might be
Yeah.
incredibly
Yeah.
eloquent, but they need like one instruction at a time. So it's just about
Right.
like slowing down, giving people lots of
Yeah.
options and saying what you mean.
That's so interesting because I'd heard that term, the spiky profile. I wasn't aware that that's what it meant, but I've heard it referred to a lot. But that's super interesting. So it's to do with like the differences in different sort of skills or areas of cognitive sort of processing or ability, etc. Great. One of the things I've heard actually, and I don't know whether you would agree with this, is that if we are able to communicate for neurodivergence. So I guess that means, some of the things that you said there, short sentences, being really clear about what we're saying, etc. It's better for everyone, right? Why wouldn't it be? Even if they're like neurotypical, I guess if we say that. Would you agree with that?
100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
completely. I often say that in training. I'm like, accessibility is for everyone. I cannot think of a single change that we would make, whether it's using shorter sentences, using more simple words, or using less jargon. It's
Yeah.
like, why would we not want to do those things? Because that's going to work better for your tired colleagues, your colleagues who are new parents who've been up all night with the baby, people who are worried, anxious, someone who's in chronic pain, someone who's maybe hungover. Like all of these changes benefit pretty much everybody. And even
Yeah.
if you have some hypothetical neurotypical colleague who's well rested, nourished, they've got no discomfort, they are like the model person with no concerns and no worries, even they will benefit from this
Yeah.
because they're just
Yeah.
it's going to be less cognitively demanding for them.
Yeah.
There's less ambiguity and they'll just be able to sort of like understand what you're saying even quicker with less effort.
Yeah.
So yeah, I see no downsides to just making
Yeah.
all of the
Absolutely.
communication a bit more accessible.
Yeah. And when you said that, things like less ambiguity and able to, it means things like, coming up, reaching consensus should be quicker. If you're working on something to get to a decision or you need people to take action, it means that there's likely to be less confusion. It's just better all round, isn't it? It's just it sounds like common sense, but we know the problems of common sense. But yeah, it just it absolutely works. And that probably takes us nicely onto if we broaden out accessibility. So in terms of talking about comms, and we broaden that out in terms of anybody that may have challenges accessing the way that information may be presented. And I'll give an example here again. I feel as though I'm in like the confession booth of Etty Bailey King this morning, but I'm currently delivering some training. And what's really interesting, anybody that's in my LinkedIn post from this week will know that there was a guide dog in my training session. First time in a face-to-face. I did actually want to spend the whole session just playing with the dog, but that's for another LinkedIn Live. But obviously, so the company that I'm working with made a point of saying to me, "Oh, we forgot to say to you," and this was a few days before we were due to do the training. You got two individuals who are going to be in the training who have visual impairments, so you just need to make sure, etc. So what that meant I had to do was make sure that my material was, it kind of got me to think, oh my gosh, how accessible is my material? These slides that I'm going to be using, and also I was. As part of the pre-work, I was sending them to another website. So I had to think, oh my gosh, how accessible is that website? And it just really got me thinking. And then even, I'm back with them next week. And again, I was thinking, okay, I need to go back through the material. And actually, I do need to go back through it because I know that there's some stuff in there that isn't. So just maybe talk to us about again, those watch areas and the things that we need to be thinking about for things like, whether it be visual impairments or hearing, etc., or some of the other senses? What are the sorts of things we need to think about?
So one of the really good things about like making our content more accessible for, let's pick one example, blind and
Yeah.
vision impaired people, is
Yeah.
all of the changes that you're going to make and are going to flow through to benefit pretty much everybody. So the example of always having descriptions of visual information. So if you've got like a
Yeah.
graph on screen or a photo of something, describing it. So like when I'm starting my training presentations, I'll be like, I'll introduce myself, I'll say my pronouns, and if there's a photo of me on the screen, I'll say like, I'm a white person with light brown hair, and I'll just describe what I look like. And I think like at its core, you're doing these descriptions so that someone who's blind and vision impaired can get the same information as someone who's sighted. But the feedback that I always get from my workshops is like, oh, wow, the way you described all the visual features really helped me, a sighted person, to understand what was going on. So lots of neurodivergent people, for example, really like having those descriptions of what
Yeah.
is visually being displayed, because it can help us,
Right.
we're worried we've misinterpreted the graph. Maybe we didn't see something
Yeah. Yeah.
in the image. Maybe we don't know what the main focus of it is. So again, like giving that description so that everybody in the room is getting sort of that explanation of what they're seeing really does benefit everyone.
Yeah.
I would say that more broadly, making sure content works for blind and vision impaired people is partly about making sure that like what you're hearing is the full story. So there's no like little secret bits of information where you need to
Yeah.
know the wider context. So for example, if there's kind of like a joke in something that's on screen and you're just describing like, oh, we've got an image of a tomato, but it's like a reference to something, and you need to like make that connection so that everyone's got access to the
Yeah.
same information. I would say explain the little in jokes if that's something that comes up in your work.
Yeah.
Explain that it's a cultural reference. Explain that it's sort of
Yeah.
making a little sideways point about something you're going to cover later.
Yeah.
And then just concentrate on all of those points we talked about previously about short sentences, using simple words, standard words, because that can really help people with wayfinding. So for any
Yeah.
of us, if we drift off a bit and we lose our focus for a moment, it just helps us come back to what's being said. And having lots of pauses in your delivery, using sort of like subheadings within everything that you talk about. So in a written document, you want to have frequent subheadings
Yeah.
because that helps people scan the page if they're sighted. But if you structure your spoken communication with sort of imaginary subheadings, it's just making it easier for people to come back to you if they sort of like just, lose their focus for a moment.
Yeah.
And what else? Yeah, it really sort of just all links together, the kind of short,
Yeah.
clear, you mean, benefits
Yeah.
everyone.
Do you know what's really interesting? As you were talking there, I almost just sort of thought there's something about the way that we have been, and I say we as like, somebody that's been in the corporate space for like, 20, 30 years, whatever, through the invention of PowerPoint, the way that we have been taught to present typically with PowerPoint is not accessible. It's, we've generally been taught things like, don't just read off the slide, just let people, I've been to lots of really great presentations, or what seem like really great presentations, where somebody might show an image and they might say, what do you see, or something. Do you know what I mean? It's just a lot of those things you were describing about, if we put a visual up and it's a joke, often what we would do as presenters is literally just almost like allow the room to take the joke in, right, rather than explaining it, because it kind of feels a bit naff if you like explain the joke, but actually it's quite inaccessible, which is like literally as you were talking there, I just thought, wow, just that whole way that I think a whole generation of us have been taught is like what a good presentation looks like, particularly with slides or visuals, is we need to totally rethink that.
Yeah, I love the way you phrase that about like, rethinking what a good presentation looks like. And I would sort of link it with, I think a lot of inclusion and accessibility is rethinking what good looks like and
Yeah.
what like professional looks like. Because
Yeah.
we've got these very narrow ideas of professional, and a lot of the time they just sort of mean behaving like a white non-disabled man in a lot of settings. And anything where you sort of like acknowledge that, you know, people in the room are disabled or have chronic pain, or that we, you know, that we're just human beings outside of this very narrow model of how we're supposed to
Yeah.
show up.
Yeah.
Think of, you know, organizations that have a no politics at work rule. Well, what does that mean? You know, your body is political if you're basically anything other than a white cis man a lot of the time. And I think it's just about allowing into the spaces that we work in, sort of like just the fullness of being a person. So that can be accessibility stuff around people's particular learning preferences. It can be just acknowledging that like people get restless, and whether you're neurodivergent and you're stimming, which is short for self-stimulatory behavior, so it's like fidgets, little movements, maybe tapping the foot, that kind of thing. Just acknowledging that that is a perfectly appropriate and professional way to be, or acknowledging that like some people aren't going to follow what you're saying if you're using loads of industry jargon, and like that's the problem. That's not them being bad employees. That's
Absolutely.
all of us using really terrible corporate language, and we just need to change that. So I love that. Yeah, I just think we need to reimagine what good and professional and normal look like.
We do. We really do. Sunaina, good morning. Sunaina, how are you doing? Sunaina said what Etty said. I'm guessing just all of it, the whole thing. I'm guessing it's definitely very much about, you know, it's what you're saying about, I think, rethinking, you know, what is professional, what is normal in terms of like behavior in the workplace and all of that, and just starting to see things differently. Which, do you know what, actually, you know, conversations like this is one of these LinkedIn Live conversations where, you know, and it's similar to some of the conversations I actually have with Sunaina, where it totally kind of turns my thinking upside down, which is that's what we need to start doing, right? If we want to change things. So yeah, that is incredible. Yeah, mind blowing, literally. Etty, final, because we've almost well, we have slightly run over time, and some people will be itching to get back to the general election results. Final thoughts or final comments for anybody that's maybe thinking about the one thing that they can do, you know, as a result of today, one thing in terms of how they can improve you know, their communications and be more inclusive. What would be one tip that you'd give either to an individual or an organization just starting on this journey?
I don't know if this is like a bit of a cheeky answer, but I genuinely believe this to be the most helpful. I would say follow my content on social media.
Yeah.
That's really self-serving. But my point is, like, I share lots of little snippets of like, this is how you can write alt text. This is what an image description is. This is how to format your email in a way that's accessibly. And I'm not trying to be like, you should like boost me. I'm more mean. I think there's lots.
Yeah, why not? Why not?
Why not? Why not, indeed? There's lots of little actions you can take. And I wouldn't say, you know, we're not going to change the world if everyone learns how to write accessible headings. That's good. That's really, really important. But that alone isn't going to change everything. And just learning how to write alt text, again, it's not going to change everything. I think it's about finding all the little snippets of action that you can take and just consistently getting into the practice of trying them. So taking messy action, knowing that you don't have to be perfect, you don't have to know everything. Just start learning, start exposing yourself to all those little tips and tricks. And just start putting them into practice right away without the expectation that you will instantly make your website perfectly accessible. Like more than 97% of the websites, the most visited websites in the world, are inaccessible, and you are probably not going to make yours like perfectly accessible to everybody overnight. There isn't such a thing as perfectly accessible. So start small and just take little actions and let them add up.
Amazing. Perfect. So follow Etty. Yes, follow Etty. Let's big up Etty. Follow Etty for sure. And so that you can continue to get those tips and continue to grow as well. Obviously, the alt text, when you talked about that, I mean, alt text, I feel like it's my nemesis, but I'm sorry, but where is the AI to just do the alt text for me, right? Is there like, if that's the one thing we could get AI onto, why can AI not just do the alt text for us?
It's so bad at it. I have seen one tool that is doing an okay job at it, but come on, AI, work harder.
Yeah. Which tool is that, Etty? So I can write it down.
I'll share the tool with you afterwards. I've just
Okay,
forgotten the name.
perfect.
Sorry.
And then we've got a comment here. Good morning. I'm going to pronounce that Inez. I hope that's correct. It could be Inez. Inez, I agree. We need to learn and then improve because starting is the most important. That's absolutely right. We've all got to start somewhere, and even just in those small ways. My one of my takeaways. I mean, alt text. I've got to go and do some more alt text for my session next week. But one of my takeaways is going to be the practicing of the pronouns, the them, they, practicing the pronouns. There's one writer I quite like actually, and she does like podcasts and things like that, Candice Brathwaite. And I've noticed when she's talking about people, she sort of says the girls, the boys, the theys, the thems, just her way of saying folks or everybody, the he's, the she's, the theys, the thems, etc. Which I think is really lovely, kind of just acknowledging. But yeah, practicing the theys, the thems is going to be my thing. So yeah, thank you for joining us, Etty Bailey King.
Thank you so much for having me, Cheryl. This has been great. Really, really enjoyed
It's
this.
a great way to start a Friday, isn't it? Thank you to everyone that has been listening to us live, especially if you're in the UK, you've taken a little bit of a break from the election results. Thank you for joining us. If you're watching on the replay, thank you for taking a bit of your time out today. Please do follow Etty because these things do make such a big difference. Sunaina, as always, sis, thank you so much for joining in such a happy and inspired place. It's rainy Friday morning. It's rainy in London. Thank you both. So many great takeaways. Happy weekend. Etty, thank you again.
Cheryl, thank you so much for having me. Thanks. And happy Friday, everyone. Have a great weekend when it comes.
Happy Friday, everyone. Take care. Go with grace.